50 years ago this weekend, one of the most powerful and controversial voices in the American civil rights movement was silenced in a storm of bullets. Malcolm X was 39 years old, the same age that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was when he was murdered 3 years later. But Malcolm X differed from Dr. King in a number of ways. Where King preached nonviolence, Malcolm X said rights should be claimed by, of course, a famous quote, "now by any means necessary." And while Dr. King was a victim of white rage, Malcolm X was gunned down by 3 men who, like him, were black. The legacy of his powerful rhetoric lives on. Malcolm X was a driving force behind black pride as well as black nationalism. And his autobiography is on the curriculum in many schools across the country to this day. Well, Alexandra Moffett-Bateau is an assistant professor of political science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Malcolm X, and welcome to the show. He was such a force in the battle for civil rights. In your opinion, why so?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with his talent for rhetoric, right? I mean, he was an unbelievably brilliant man as well as well-spoken. So he was someone who, during his entire time in prison, spent it learning and reading and educating himself, not just about Nation of Islam, but about a diversity of religious perspectives and political perspectives. So when he was released and became a religious leader, you know, people were really drawn to that about him.
Interestingly enough, you know, in the 21st century, we've talked a lot about the radicalization of prison inmates in France, and maybe the reason why we've seen some of this terror over there. Back here in the 60s, we see it in a different way, perhaps maybe a little less radical in a sense, but he was radicalized, I guess you could use that word, in prison. What was it in those environs that made him the person that he was when he got out?
Well, I think the experience of mass incarceration, right? He had a very difficult time in prison. Nation of Islam at that time was recruiting folks from within the prison space, right? Offering them a space for religious comfort as well as political comfort, and kind of offering a broader contextual understanding for what was happening to him. So, you know, Malcolm was very moved by that, understandably so.
So you have now, in the 60s, you know, maybe perhaps a boiling point with social oppression, civil rights, especially when it deals with people of color, African Americans in this country. And then you have Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on one hand, a pacifist, you know, kind of a Gandhiist type. And then you have Malcolm X with the Nation of Islam. What was it about his relationship with the Nation of Islam that caused him to have more of a radical view in your mind? Well,
you know, people tend to create these binaries between King and Malcolm, but what we don't always acknowledge about King is that by the time he died, he was what we would consider much more radicalized, particularly around questions of poverty, incarceration, and what was going on in urban cities, right? Whereas with Malcolm, over time, became less radicalized in the kind of traditional sense that we think of him, right? So he was actually starting to think about how can we include more people into the movements for black freedom and equality by the time he was passed.
And then there's this epiphany, as I like to call it, when he makes his trip to Mecca. And he sees something totally different there, which transformed his feeling about color, about race, about all those things. Tell us about that.
Well, I think he experienced Islam in a way that was different, completely different from the narrative that NOI at the time had painted for him, right? That Islam was actually an international, interracial religious practice that was practiced by people all over the world, right? And this had a profound impact on Malcolm's not only religious but political sensibilities. So he comes back to the United States and he starts thinking about, okay, how can we still continue to push for equality for black people, but still, and do it by garnering the support of others, right? But still having folks of color, low-income people at the forefront.
What are the most important aspects in your mind about the legacy of Malcolm X?
Well, one of the things that I think is critical when we think about Malcolm X is his role as a question asker, right? Like, even in his most militant days, Malcolm taught us how to push back and to ask important political questions. We tend to get into this thing of political messiahs, where you look at people like King or whomever, Barack Obama, as these kind of folks who are not to be touched, almost political deities within the Black community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Malcolm X taught us that everyone should be questioned, that there's room for a multiplicity of perspectives, and that's valuable when we're debating about how to best approach the question of freedom and equality within the Black community.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot still to be learned about Malcolm X, and of course, reading on his legacy still used in schools today, as of course we mentioned here. Professor Moffett-Bateau, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. And getting ready for the Oscars, we have Mike Sargent here in the studio and Shannon Lanier live in Los Angeles.